thank you so much. We're very excited to have this plenary on Venezuela. And thank you, George, for organizing this on behalf of CSI. Venezuela now is in quite a bit of turmoil, and there's been a lot of contradictory evidence about which way going forward and what is the U.S. policy towards Venezuela. We have three distinguished panelists this evening. We're going to hear from Mr. Geoff Ramsey, who serves as the Washington Office on Latin America with WOLA as the Assistant Director for Venezuela. Mr. Ramsey coordinated WOLA's coverage of the December 2015 legislative elections from Caracas and contributes to WOLA's Venezuelan Politics and Human Rights blog. Previously, he worked for WOLA's Research and Communications as WOLA's Research and Communications Associate, preparing the hemisphere's most pressing human rights, drug policy, and security issues. Before joining WOLA, Mr. Ramsey carried out consulting work as a researcher for the Open Society Foundation's Latin American program, and his most recent work involved monitoring civil society advocacy and implementation for the 2013 drug policy reforms in Uruguay, where he lived for 2 years. He also lived in Colombia and Brazil, where he researched and reported on regional insecurity for Insight Crime. And following these two elucidating presentations, we will have an equally elucidating presentation by Mr. Peter Bolton. Mr. Bolton is the Director on the Council of Hemispheric Affairs, COHA. He is a regular contributor to The Canary, a UK-based publication, and he has penned articles about Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, Cuba, and Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. He has worked as a freelance journalist in Colombia covering issues such as labor rights and on the Colombian armed conflict for publications including The Guardian, Colombia Rights, Upside Down World. He has partnered with human rights organizations including Witness for Peace and Peace Brigades International. He holds a master's degree in ethics, peace, and global affairs from American University.
Thank you. I wanted to keep my presentation relatively brief and leave time for question and answers, as I'm sure we're going to have a very robust discussion. I look forward to it. But I wanted to really focus on two components here. One, I wanted to look at recent history in Venezuela, and the other, I wanted to focus on the U.S. government response, because I think you really can't have a conversation about Venezuela without recognizing what's happened in the country since 2015. In December 2015, the Venezuelan opposition won a 2/3 majority in the National Assembly, in the Congress, and ever since then, the president of Venezuela, Maduro, has done everything he can to avoid having to actually share power with the opposition. It's true that the opposition hasn't always played fair, and it's certainly true that over time extremist voices have crawled their way to the top with U.S. support of the Venezuelan opposition. But we shouldn't use that to give a pass to the actions of the Maduro government. I just want to remind everybody that in July 2017, this is just a short period after the opposition won control of the legislature, Maduro, rather than continue to have to negotiate with the opposition or really have to submit to the basic rules of democracy, of power sharing, of checks and balances, illegally convened a constituent assembly. He called for the creation of a body that would rewrite a new constitution. It has been going up on almost 2 years since this body was created, and not a single word of this new constitution has been made public. Also, this constituent assembly was convoked under absolutely unconstitutional means. Chavez himself, in 1999, after elected, ran on the promise of organizing a constituent assembly and of a new constitution in Venezuela. But under the terms of the Venezuelan constitution, and these terms are still in place today, if you look at, I think it's Article 187 of the Venezuelan Constitution, it establishes that the executive power has the authority to convene a constituent assembly, but that this must be approved by the Venezuelan people. Chavez went through this process. He convened a constituent assembly and announced that he was going to put forward this effort and put it up to Venezuelans to vote on whether or not they agreed to having to creating a new constitution. And Venezuelans overwhelmingly voted to do so. Maduro skipped that step. He convened a constituent assembly, but did not put it to vote. Instead, he organized the votes on the makeup of this constituent assembly and invited the opposition to participate. This was widely denounced by the opposition, by former members of Chavez's own government, and by international human rights groups as a very clear violation of constitutional democracy in Venezuela. And ever since then, Venezuela has been in a deep constitutional crisis. I think it's also clear that the elections since 2015 have deteriorated in quality. We have not seen an election in Venezuela with international observation since Hugo Chavez died. Instead what we've seen is Maduro welcome international electoral accompaniment. And there is a very, very important distinction between accompaniment missions and observation missions. Electoral accompaniment missions involve tours around the country, being shown how the voting system works, perhaps going to 2 or 3 different polling places. But accompaniment missions do not have access to voter tally sheets, for instance. These were nothing new. I mean, under Chavez, there were widespread international electoral observation missions that were allowed in by the UN, by the EU, and other actors. The Carter Center famously had very good access to the electoral machinery in Venezuela. However, since 2015, Maduro has been very reticent to allow any kind of international or domestic electoral observation. He's only allowed accompaniment. So I think where that leads us today is that we have a government that has an executive power that has stayed, as it has become increasingly unpopular due to the economic crisis that has been aggravated by the international community and by the United States, obviously. Rather than negotiate any kind of concessions or ability to share power with opposing forces in the country, they have dug in and entrenched themselves and refused to agree to any kind of meaningful power sharing arrangement that is matched by the popularity of the executive branch. Polls will show you that Maduro himself has the support of around 15-20% of Venezuelans, which is astounding considering the state of the economic crisis. I mean, we really should remember that what was the famous example of the Temer in Brazil had something like 5% approval rating. So there's absolutely no denying that Chavismo has a widespread political support in the country, and as a result of the economic benefits and the fact that marginalized populations for the first time saw themselves reflected under Chavez's government. This legacy lives on for many Venezuelans, and as a result, they identify with Chavismo as a political force and support Maduro. I think nobody can deny that. However, we also have to recognize that credible polling shows that Guaido, the president of the National Assembly, has the support of something like 70%, 75% of the country. And so I think that, yes, it's very important to recognize that Chavismo has a historical legacy of support. And in fact, the favorability rating, if you ask many Venezuelans about Hugo Chavez himself and whether they still identify with him, you'll get favorable answers from about 45-50% of Venezuela. Again, that's very, very important. But Maduro does not have popular supports, and he has entrenched himself in state and power through undemocratic means. That takes us to the May 2018 electoral process, which was deeply flawed. Maduro refused to allow any kind of international observation and did not accredit domestic observers either. There were no groups that had access to voter tally sheets in the country, which is a complete departure from previous presidential elections in Venezuela. I also think it's important to note that there were flaws such as the use of indelible ink, which is used to prevent double voting, were not in place. The elections were also announced under a very short period. They were convened and held in just a few months. And these normally, any electoral expert in Venezuela will tell you it takes 6 to 8 months to organize credible elections in Venezuela, and these were not organized under credible conditions. The opposition boycotted the elections. I think that was a mistake because there's plenty of reason to believe that they could have won, even under the lack of very clear guarantees that were in place, simply because of how deeply unpopular Maduro was. However, they chose to boycott it. The main exception to that was Henry Falcón, former governor of Lara State, who ran because he understood the way that Venezuela's electoral machinery works and believed that even despite all of the ventajismo, the advantage afforded to the party in power, the simple fact was that Maduro was deeply unpopular and he had a good chance of winning. And polls, in fact, showed that he had widespread support, and many of us were expecting him to actually win on the basis of that. However, that's not, and his participation in this 2018 elections was actually contingent on an accord that he signed with Maduro. Maduro agreed to making all kinds of concessions, such as allowing for international observation, for reconfiguring the CNE, the National Electoral Council, and a number of other checks and balances that would need to be in place for these elections to be credible. In 2017, the U.S. began economic sanctions. So the U.S. started to to sanction Venezuelan access to the financial system. So the Venezuelan government was not able to access bank accounts or really access the U.S. financial system under 3 exceptions. I think that these are really important, and this is not particularly well known. The August 2017 financial sanctions that were imposed by the Trump administration did not apply to transactions having to do with the import of food, nor would they apply to transactions having to do with the import of medicine, and they wouldn't apply to any transactions or any new debt that was approved by the legitimately elected National Assembly. This was a strong incentive for Maduro to come to the table once more and share power with the legislature and function within the normal rules of democracy, and he chose not to do it. Finally, in January of this year, we saw the U.S. impose oil sanctions. These oil sanctions do not contain any of the exceptions of the financial sanctions and are broadly non-discriminatory, and they amount to essentially collective punishment of the Venezuelan population, because the oil sector in Venezuela accounts for about 75% of the hard currency that the Venezuelan state uses to pay for imports. And that's imports of everything. That's imports of food, medicine, essential goods, everything. We have not yet seen the full impact of these oil sanctions. The grace period for them ends, I believe, on April 30th. I'm expecting to see the economic crisis on the ground in Venezuela get much worse as a result of these sanctions, and I think it's going to deepen human suffering, and we're deeply concerned by that. So the first response has been sanctions. The second response has been recognition. The U.S. has recognized Guaido as the legitimate president. They've given him control of a number of diplomatic facilities in the United States. They've also pushed heavily for him to be, for his emissaries to be recognized in the OAS and in the Inter-American Development Bank. They're pushing for it at the UN. And this campaign has succeeded with the recognition of over 50 countries around the globe. The third, covert operations. The U.S. has been trying its hardest to ensure some kind of split within the armed forces. I think it's pretty unlikely that we'll see some kind of transition in Venezuela without a break in the ranks of the armed forces. And we just haven't seen that. I mean, the simple truth is that the dominant strategy of the United States for the last 6 months has been one of doing everything they can to provoke a fissure in the military so that they rise up, overthrow Maduro, unplug from Maduro, plug into Guaido, and then facilitate some kind of negotiated transition from there. And it just hasn't happened. It's been incredible. I mean, the armed forces of Venezuela are under tremendous pressure, and they show no signs of splitting. That's partly because everybody at the top of the pyramid has benefited under 20 years of Chavismo and has very strong relations with Maduro and benefits economically. There are a number of state companies that are controlled by the military. The National Guard actually has direct control over imports and exports in the country, and there's been widespread reporting of their involvement in illicit food trafficking. The armed forces, the head of the oil sector until recently was also a general in the National Guard. There's also in Venezuela a state television agency which is controlled by the military. So the military in Venezuela has been given many perks and many incentives to remain loyal to Chavismo over 20 years. And so everybody at the top benefits from this. Everybody at the bottom is suffering deeply under the economic crisis. Lower-ranking figures in the Venezuelan military are the first to be hit by the deepening scarcity of food, medicine, and essential goods, and they have families outside their barracks who are also suffering from the economic crisis. However, they're the ones with the least ability to do anything about it. Everybody in between, from the top to the bottom, is under very strict surveillance. Venezuelan counterintelligence is extremely strong, and all of them are under severe monitoring. There have been a number of coup attempts over the last several years. There was, this is all public, there was one in March, there was one in May of last year, and there was another one in January. And all of them have been unsuccessful. So where that leads us, I think, is for the U.S. to increasingly accept that the only way forward, the only way out of this crisis that avoids a total collapse and a worsening of the humanitarian crisis, the displacement crisis, just a complete implosion of anything resembling order in Venezuela, is to pursue some kind of negotiated solution. As Fulton mentioned, there is an international contact group that was created in late January that is made up of 8 European Union countries as well as 3 Latin American countries. The Uruguayans, the Ecuadorians, and the Costa Ricans are participating in this group. And they have had unparalleled access to the Venezuelan government, to Maduro, as well as to the opposition. They've sent 2 now technical missions to Caracas that have met with all sides and are currently hashing out the conditions needed to carry out some kind of credible electoral solution to the crisis. Having just come from Venezuela and talked to, I would say, all relevant actors, I'm pretty confident that the contact group will reach some kind of overlap in the positions of the parties. I just don't believe that it'll happen under its current mandate, which expires by the end of April. Fortunately, the group has given itself a motive to renew its mandate. They've taken on a secondary mission, which is addressing the humanitarian crisis. The recent access given to the Red Cross in Venezuela, the fact that Maduro has allowed the Red Cross to come in and bring in humanitarian aid under neutral, independent terms, obviously a far cry from the farce that we saw on the Colombian border on February 23rd, I think is a very positive step. And I think this kind of gesture, as well as the fact that the UN in the coming days, if I'm not mistaken, is expected to ratchet up its own humanitarian presence in Venezuela, will provide the contact group with a justification for renewing its mandate. And in the next 90 days of its mandate, I'm expecting the rubber to really hit the road and for some kind of serious, credible, negotiated solution to emerge from that. Because the alternative is complete disaster. I mean, the alternative is just going off the rails and accepting that there is a complete failed state in South America, and that doesn't appeal to anybody. That doesn't appeal to the United States. That doesn't appeal to China. That doesn't appeal to Russia. No country will have its economic interests met if Venezuela collapses entirely. And with that, I'll yield the floor, I think.
I've got a few prepared remarks, and if I may, I'd like to respond to some of the other comments that have been made, though of course we can continue that in the question and answer session. There's two things I'd like to do majorly tonight, though. The first is to argue that the coup has been a failure, and to argue that the only way out of it is to move towards dialogue between the two sides. And then, second of all, I'd like to go into 5 myths of the coup in Venezuela that are being propagated by Washington and the mainstream media, and I'll do my best to debunk some of those myths. So, in terms of the coup having failed, it's now about 3 to 4 months since the beginning of the coup in late January of this year. Maduro remains in power. This is in spite of crippling sanctions that my colleague Mr. Ramsey mentioned, which now apply not just to the financial sector but also to Venezuela's oil sector, which is a major part of the Venezuelan economy and accounts for over 90% of its imports. What was originally hoped by the United States and its proxies in Venezuela, Plan A, was for a significant amount of the Venezuelan military to defect to the side of Guaido and then overthrow the government through a military alliance. This has not happened, and aside from a handful of defections, the military remains overwhelmingly loyal to President Maduro. Mr. Guaido, on the other hand, is losing support even within his own opposition faction. Some of the more moderate members of the Venezuelan opposition, such as Claudio Fermin and Lady Gomez of the Acción Democrática party, are openly speaking out against the coup strategy of Guaido and his hardline faction. It's becoming clear, furthermore, that Guaido and his backers in Washington are becoming increasingly desperate. After failing to win over significant parts of the military, for example, Guaido went in the hope of winning over public sector unions, who have generally been supportive of Chavismo and the government, yet also failed to do so. People like John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, Mike Pompeo, and Mr. Trump himself have taken to issuing ever more extreme and ridiculous threats against the Maduro government. I should also mention Mr. Marco Rubio of the Senate, whose antics have included comparing the situation in Venezuela to Libya and threatening Mr. Maduro with the same treatment that was dished out to Colonel Gaddafi. For those of you that don't remember, Colonel Gaddafi was sodomized by a bayonet, and his body was left to be have parts taken as trophies by those who opposed his government. As much as the opposition, Washington, the mainstream media, and WOLA will wish to tell you, The Maduro government is very willing to enter into dialogue and has been all along. It's willing, furthermore, to grant major concessions, as it has done in the past. In fact, there was a meeting between the Venezuelan opposition and the government about a year ago, where there was a document that both sides had agreed to. The government had signed, and the opposition was about to sign, but at the last minute it received a call from Washington, and they were told, no, do not sign the document, we have something better in mind. We'll help you with a coup attempt. And so the opposition left the table, and the agreement that had been already accepted by both sides was thrown into the trash. It's clear that it's the opposition that is the recalcitrant party, not the government. And this has been shown not just since the beginning of their control of the National Assembly, but from the beginning of Chavismo in 1998. Ever since they won their supermajority in the National Assembly, they have said quite openly that their primary and in fact only goal is to remove President Maduro from power, not to cooperate with his government in any way, not to work collaboratively to solve the many economic problems that face the country, but rather what they call the salida, which in Spanish means the exit. So with that, I'd like to move on to my 5 myths about the US-backed coup. Myth number 1 is that the US intervention is predicated on some kind of humanitarian or human rights concerns. This is completely ludicrous. The reality is that the US doesn't care one iota about humanitarian crises or human rights violation, whether it be in Venezuela, the wider region, or anywhere else. Not only has it turned a blind eye to huge humanitarian crises in Colombia, Honduras, Yemen, and along its own border with Mexico, but has in fact been complicit with many of these humanitarian crises. There's been a huge humanitarian crisis going on in Colombia for decades. In fact, the country has, according to some estimates, the largest internal refugee population in the entire world. We didn't hear a peep out of Washington for all those decades. As a matter of fact, Washington was funding governments such as that of Alvaro Uribe, who was committing a brutal campaign against social leaders in cahoots with right-wing paramilitaries, as was exposed by the parapolitics scandal. The same could be said of Honduras, which has been, ever since the coup, which was backed by the State Department in 2009, has been descending into an ever-worsening human rights nightmare, where state securities frequently kill social activists such as Berta Cáceres with almost complete impunity. And all the while, the United States has been funding these governments and arming them to the teeth. As a matter of fact, Washington has engineered a humanitarian crisis in Central America. And then when the consequent happens of refugees fleeing and wanting to come to the United States, the Trump administration says that he can see circumstances in which they would be met with lethal force should they attempt to enter the US, having fled the nightmare that Washington has created in their own country. It's like what John Milton said, that they who cast out the people's eyes then condemn them for their blindness. And we also have to mention Yemen, where an actual humanitarian crisis is taking place, not a conjured up one, as is alleged to be taking place in Venezuela. It has caused one of the largest famines in recent history, and the US again has been complicit by arming the Saudis to the teeth to conduct this brutal war. And we hear crickets from Washington all along. So in sum, the United States does not have a shred of credibility, whether it be in Latin America or anywhere else for that matter, based on its behavior. There's also myth number 2 I would like to go into, is the idea that this coup attempt by Guaido and his puppet masters in Washington represents some kind of return to democracy. The reality is that just as with human rights and humanitarianism, the United States does not care 1 ounce about democracy. Just to give you one example, it recognized the fraudulent 2017 election of Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras. Even the pro-Washington Organization of American States denounced it and called for fresh elections. Has anyone ever heard from Washington or the mainstream media a peep about that, or one suggestion that there should be some kind of intervention to save the Honduran people from this travesty? You haven't heard a thing. And then there's the historical context. Washington has propped up dictators across the hemisphere, whether it be the murderous Pinochet regime in Chile, which murdered thousands of people and tortured thousands more. It backed the Batista dictatorship in Cuba. It backed the military junta in Argentina. It trained death squads during the civil war in El Salvador. And it's overthrown democratically elected governments all over the region, not just in Chile, but as in Honduras, as I mentioned. What's going on here is what COHA's late director, the late Larry Burns, described as selective indignation. Everything that Washington does, all things like human rights, humanitarianism, they're all tacked on by Washington in order to justify a preordained solution. And furthermore, what makes this particularly ironic is the legitimacy of the Venezuelan 2018 election was nowhere near as dubious as Mr. Ramsey is making out, or as Washington or the mainstream media makes out. There were over 100 election observers, including COHA personnel who were there, overseeing what happened. We're told how the opposition were crowded out, how they were banned. Well, as it happens, the opposition boycotted the election deliberately when they could have participated. It's true that there were a few people banned, such as Leopoldo Lopez, but simply look at the way that these people have behaved in their opposition of the government. The US and its allies decided not to recognize the legitimacy of this election several months before it had even happened. So it was a preordained decision that was then simply, the election, it was simply a formality. The US was never going to accept it. So it had nothing to do with the actual empirical facts of what took place. Myth number 3 that I would like to address is the idea that Juan Guaido represents a return to democracy in Venezuela. This self-appointed interim figure is an obscure figure in Venezuelan politics. He was elected to the National Assembly, for instance, with just 26% of the vote from a tiny coastal district called Vargas, which is the 3rd smallest state in Venezuela by population. Before he even appointed himself to this role, over 80% of the Venezuelan public had never even heard of him. He does not have a large following, furthermore. In fact, his party is a fringe hardline faction within the Venezuelan opposition. Rallies and marches in support of him have been disappointing. And worst of all, and this is what most undermines his credibility, is that Guaido is a US puppet, and worse still, has a history of involvement in violence. He was a member of the Garimberos, who launched violent street protests in 2014 in an attempt to use extra-constitutional methods to overthrow the government. They engage in acts such as setting fires, setting up barricades, and violently confronting security forces and civilians perceived to be sympathetic to the government. And furthermore, the idea that Guaido and his faction are deeply committed to the Venezuelan constitution is laughable when you look at the history of how the opposition have treated the Venezuelan constitution. This constitution was enacted after the election of Hugo Chavez, but the heirs of Guaido, of the Venezuelan opposition, boycotted the elections that elected the assembly that drafted the constitution. when they launched the US-backed coup in 2002, which was also orchestrated by the heirs of Guaido, the first order of business of Pedro Carmona, who was the interim president of that time, was to declare the constitution null and void and dissolve the National Assembly and Supreme Tribunal of Justice, the Venezuelan equivalent of the Supreme Court. Some upholders of the Venezuelan constitution they are. In short, these are not the good guys in Venezuelan politics. And the idea that they have 70% support from the Venezuelan population is so laughable, I feel like it would be beneath my dignity to even respond to it. According to Alfred de Zayas, the UN rapporteur, who did an extensive study into Venezuela, between 7 and 9 million Venezuelans consider themselves committed Chavistas. The opposition faction that Guaido represents isn't even representative of the Venezuelan opposition itself. So, what is it that motivates Washington, the foreign policy establishment, and its proxies in Venezuela? It's the same motivation that it's always been: naked self-interest. Venezuela has been singled out because it threatens US geopolitical and strategic and economic interests in the region and the wider world. For example, it has threatened the Monroe Doctrine by promoting regional integration and calling for Latin American independence. It's been strengthening regional organizations such as UNASUR and founding some such as CELAC and Banco del Sur, which threaten Washington's hegemony and provide what Bolivian President Evo Morales described as a weapon against imperialism. And worst of all, as far as Washington is concerned, and this is what made Chavez such a devil, is that he threatened US economic interests in the region. For example, by nationalizing the US agricultural giant, or partially nationalizing Cargill Inc. And also, incidentally, the Chavista governments have been staunch supporters of the Palestinian cause and spoken out against Zionist oppression and Israeli apartheid on the world stage, and embarrassed the US by bringing greater attention to this human rights nightmare in the Middle East. With that, I'd like to move to myth number 4 that I would like to discuss with you tonight. We heard from Mr. Ramsey that 50 countries in the world recognize Juan Guaido as a legitimate president of Venezuela. What he leaves out is that in reality a majority of countries in the world actually still recognize Maduro. This includes 4 of the 5 major emerging BRICS nations: Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Most of the rest of Africa continues to recognize Maduro. Many of the CARICOM Caribbean nations continue to recognize Maduro. Many Middle Eastern countries continue to recognize Maduro. And of course, the stalwart regional allies of Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Cuba continue to recognize Maduro. But there's something else going on beneath the surface here. The support from the European countries for Guaido has to be taken with a grain of salt. These countries have long been beholden to US power, not least through the influence of international institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. They've long had to kowtow to US interests because of the huge buying power of the US and its ability to coerce other countries, having been left as the only superpower at the end of the Cold War. And even those European countries are divided. The government of Italy, for example, is made up of an alliance of a left-wing populist party and a right-wing populist party. The right-wing populist party that makes up part of the coalition supports Guaido, but the left-wing populist party, called the Five Star Movement, continues to recognize President Maduro. So there's a great deal more division within the European countries that you'll never hear anything about in the mainstream media, or from Washington, or probably from WOLA. And that goes for Spain as well, by the way. Finally, I'd like to move to myth number 5. And that is this idea that we hear ad nauseum from Washington and its minions in the mainstream media, that Venezuela is a dictatorship, that it's a narco state, that it's a basket case of incompetence and corruption, and that it's on the verge of being a failed state. And worst of all, it somehow shows that socialism always ends in failure. The causes of the latest economic crisis, for instance, are highly complex and highly contested amongst experts. Venezuela has always had a highly unstable economy because of its dependence on oil. This leaves it subject to huge catastrophes when oil prices fall. This happened in 1983, for instance, during the right-wing government of Luis Herrera, precipitating an economic crisis with many of the same characteristics as this one going on right now. Did anybody claim at the time that that proves that capitalism doesn't work? I think not. As figures of both on the left and the right have pointed out, the fixed exchange rate has also been one of the major causes of the crisis, because it led to unexpected effects on demand for currency. But this is common to resource-rich countries, especially petro-states. Both Saudi Arabia and Nigeria have fixed exchange rates. For example, Mark Weisbrot, the progressive economist, has argued that Venezuela should leave the fixed exchange rate and move to a floating exchange rate. But what he leaves out is that the fixed exchange rate was used to prevent capital flight in the first place. Furthermore, Venezuela's human rights record is not particularly egregious compared to the rest of the world or even the rest of the hemisphere. And again, it's important to look at this in the wider context. For instance, in comparison with Honduras, Colombia, Mexico, Honduras, Saudi Arabia, or whichever other country you wish to pick that is a US ally. And with that, I think my time is a little bit more than up. And so I will conclude my remarks so we can move on to the question and answer. Thank you.
I think what I would like to hear would be just a quick yes and no, just because there's so many differing voices on this, and then we're going to give our participants a chance to actually give a rebuttal. But I would like to hear, a couple of, just like, I don't like bifurcation normally, binary answers, but just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to engage, please indulge me for this for a second. So, Chavez, good or bad?
That's a ridiculous bifurcation, no.
No?
There's no good politicians.
Okay, so, all right, okay, well, positive for the country or not positive for the country?
Very positive for the country.
Okay, Chavez, positive for the country or not positive for the country?
Chavez was a lion of a man. His intellect towered over these mental midgets that are having their strings pulled from Washington. He was an intellectual, and he was a revolutionary, and was a visionary for the region and for the world to resist neoliberalism and to resist US imperialism. And I would not think it's an exaggeration to call him the greatest political leader so far this century. I hope that is as unequivocal.
I know, okay.
It borders on exaggeration.
So I'm just, Joe on the street trying to take a pulse here, right? This is me playing social researcher. And so, Maduro, genuine, positive for the country, not positive for the country?
I would say on balance, not particularly positive for the country.
Okay.
He's in an impossible situation because he doesn't have the charisma that Chavez has. The opposition and their overlords in Washington see a weak underbelly that they can attack, and he's been in an impossible situation. He's, I think, made mistakes.
Okay, let me tweak that a different way. Does he have the support of the country?
I think that the policies of Chavismo have the support of the majority of the country. And there's a debate about whether Maduro is in a position to continue those policies. And so there's a debate going on within the ruling PSUV, the Chavista party, as to whether perhaps he should be replaced by somebody else from the party, whether there needs to be internal reform. So again, I think that there's so much nuance to questions like that. I hesitate to give a terse answer.
No, I appreciate that. Okay. Guido, positive or negative for the country?
Irrelevant. Not a, has no de facto power.
Well, I guess I can only answer it this way. Imagine if somebody in the United States had done what Guaido had done in Venezuela. Imagine if some politician from the left who's very opposed to the US economic system, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, said that I'm going to declare myself the interim president of the United States because the 2016 presidential election, Trump didn't win the popular vote. And in any case, the US presidential system, election system, has been totally corrupted by the influence of money and by extensive voter suppression, particularly in the South. And that then I'm going to go to a foreign government and ask for their help, who are willing to use all means of regime change, up to and including military force. And imagine, furthermore, if that country had a record of overthrowing state governors throughout the US that it didn't like, and propping up dictatorships in neighboring countries. Do you really think that what would happen to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would be just what's been done? Had a few accounts of frozen and barred from running for office? There'd be no question that she would either be spending the rest of her life in prison or be executed for treason, which after all is a capital crime under US federal law. So I think Guaido's pretty damn lucky that he isn't in prison right now, and jolly well should be, in my view.
Thank you. So let's have a big round of applause.